Dean, who has recently been elected to council, and we look forward very much, Councillor Tim, to working with you. Thank you. First item on the agenda is declarations of interest, please. We have no declarations of interest. Item 2 on the agenda are the minutes of previous, it is meetings in this case. We have to take April, please, as well as May. So first of all, we'll take April. Are there any comments as to the accuracy of the minutes, please? Councillor Guy.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. C1719, flexi time. It's reported that I said they were unwarranted. My concerns were addressed. I don't think unwarranted is a fair word to use in the report.
Thank you.
So can we change that to my concerns were addressed? Because what happened was the flexi time policy went from 3 years to 6 months.
Okay.
So I was happy with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there, Councillor Williams?
Thank you, Chairman. It's not technically an accuracy matter, it's just a clarification. On page 3, the Chief Exec talks about a report being brought back to members to clarify the role of the Town Hall. I was wondering if we could be a bit more specific about that and, if possible, expedite it, bearing in mind recent events which have happened in the Town Hall.
Thank you. So, with those amendments, please, could I have a proposal for the adoption of the April minutes? Thank you. Councillor Guy. Seconder, please. Councillor Smith. All those in favour? Thank you. We'll move on swiftly to the minutes of the May meeting. Are there any issues, please, to do with the accuracy of the May minutes? No, in that case, could I please have a proposer for their adoption? Councillor Grottick, seconded by Councillor Smith. All those in favour? Thank you. Item 3 on the agenda is Chairman's announcements. I have none. I've already made it. Item 4 on the agenda, questions under Standing Order 14. I have none. Item 5, to consider reports from committees. I have none. Item 6, to consider motions in accordance with Standing Order 12. I have none. Item 7 on the agenda, urgent items. I have none. Item 8 on the agenda under Part 1 is an update on the local plan preparation, and I hand over to Senior Manager Craig Dryden. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. So the report is just to update members in terms of where we are in terms of the local plan adoption. So you'll see from the report that there has been, again, some slippage, and that's mainly due to the fact that we need to consider some of the consultation responses we received to the draft local plan, particularly around housing and also around minerals. So we're asking members just to revise the local development scheme, which is in effect the timetable for the local plan. There will be a report brought back to members in July when the finalised draft plan will be presented to members with a view to submitting it to the Secretary of State.
Thank you. Councillor Marcus.
Thank you, Chairman. I just would like to just pay tribute to the hard work that is going on in the planning department by the officers, and that it's remiss of me, but we are going to try and organise a local plan working group to finalise, to give members sight of the amendments for the local plan ahead of full council. So I'll be emailing members for a date of that in the next week.
Thank you. Any other comments, please, about the local plan? No, thank you. Well, in that case, we have a recommendation that members approve the revised local plan preparation timetable known as the Local Development Scheme 8, LDS 8. Could I have a proposer, please? Councillor Marcus, seconded by Councillor Mumford. All those in favour, please. It's unanimous. Thank you. Item 9 on the agenda is the fourth quarter 2018-19 outturn financial report, page 25. Hand over to our 1-5 officer, Russell. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. As set out in front of you, members, as the Chairman has announced, is the fourth quarter finance performance report. That is the final one for the year, so it's the outturn position. I'll quickly run you through, assuming that you have read it, but I'll bring your attention to a few points that I want to raise. I think firstly to say that we've actually managed to submit the statutory accounts to the external auditors by the 31st of May deadline. Okay, it was on the 30th, but that is the new deadline that was introduced 2 years ago, much quicker than it used to be. And in terms of the council, we haven't met the statutory deadline for a number of years now, and that was when the statutory deadline was the end of September. In the last couple of years, the accounts have come much later than that and in December. So I think we're in a much better position now. The statutory accounts have been submitted to the auditors, and they will be carrying out that audit as we speak. And the idea is that their final report on the accounts will be ready for the meeting at the end of July. So we are probably 6 months ahead of where we've been in the last 2 or 3 years. So I think that's a good news story of how we are progressing. In terms of the actual accounts for the year, I think in the last report I set out that due to the speed of having to close the accounts, that any reserve movements that hadn't already been approved, I would take a decision on making those decisions, because there isn't time to come back to a full council and get approval. In section 1.3, I set out the reserve movements that we did put it within the accounts in closing of the accounts for the year. 55,000 being transferred to the general fund reserve, which was the net underspend against the financial plan. 3,500 for the community chest reserve. Okay, another one which I think you were all aware of that we were going to do. 14,500 from the water reserve to fund the net deficit at year end, and 23,000, which was a grant that we received, I think, on the last day of the year. We didn't have time in closing the accounts to actually, it came with no detail. We didn't have time to ascertain what it was in closing the accounts. We've since identified it as the social care grant for the new year. So we've put it in the reserve to get it over year end, and we will take it back out of there in the new year. So those were the reserve movements that I did under the delegation in closing the accounts. In terms of the revenue budget monitoring, we underspent at the year end by 55,000 in total. That is quite consistent with the forecasting as we went through the year. You remember that I think we started off forecasting for a number of months at about 45 to 50,000 underspend. We increased that at the end of the third quarter to 64,000. We did actually increase that in January to 95, and it has fallen back to 55. And I think lesson learned there is perhaps the January forecast was done without as much rigor as we do on a quarterly basis, because it's done as a quicker exercise. If it wasn't for that, I think we've outturned very close to what we've been forecasting all year. That gives you some confidence that when we bring in forecasts earlier in the year, actually they do actually turn out to be reasonably accurate to the end of the year position. So an underspend of 55,000 against the financial plan, and say that's a good outcome for the year. I think it shows that we'll be living within the financial plan. There are variations as set out later in the report between certain headings, but in total we are managing within the financial plan that we approved. Moving on, the analysis that is at the top of page 28 in your pack, that shows the variation by spend type. There are a few variances here that came out at year end. The employee figure was distorted by the exit payment of the previous chief exec, so has moved quite considerably since the report at the end of the third quarter. and there was a significant movement between supplies and services and income, which reflected picking up and showing some of the grant schemes that were not in the original budget, which we picked up at year end. We've addressed that in the new year, because if you remember when you approved the budget in early March, we had a new section in the budget for those projects to make sure that they are more clearly identified going forward, and we have a better monitoring in place. In terms of capital expenditure, the outturn was 1.236 million against a budget of 2.2 originally, although we did forecast at the end of the third quarter it'd be about 1.6 million, but still a significant slippage. Now, in my experience, this is not an unusual position. I say slippage rather than underspend, because a lot of it is expenditure that will occur, but it will occur within the current financial year, and it's timing of the expenditure rather than an under and overspend. As I say, I think it's a problem wherever I've worked that we're over-optimistic on the level of progress on the capital programme and when payments will be made. Hopefully now we've got sight of it, we've got the monitoring in place, we've only recently introduced the capital monitoring. We can fine-tune that going forward and get that better. As I say, I wouldn't want members to be alarmed about it, because I know in other organisations they suffer exactly the same process, that people are over-optimistic how quickly a capital programme will get up and off the ground and spending. The key bit to remember on capital programme really is, does it deliver over its life to its total budget and deliver the outcomes that were promised by the scheme in its first instance? The timing between the years is less of an issue. Okay, the expenses for senior managers are also set out there. We've taken on board that a lot of the expenses don't go through the expense claim system, because they're paid for directly, so we will be reviewing that for a different way of monitoring that for you in the new year. As set out at the bottom of page 29, the forecast savings, we originally had £216,000 worth of savings built into the budget. As we've progressed through the year, we've been measuring and monitoring that for you, and we had a shortfall of 80,000, which we reported at the end of the third quarter. That didn't change between then and out term, but as you're aware, we actually fed that into next year's budget. So that 80,000 savings was taken out of the budget and replaced by alternative savings, which is the point of monitoring your savings, which is the point that the external auditors make. You need to monitor your savings. If you don't deliver, you need to mitigate them in year, and you need to put them into your MTFP to make sure that you find an alternative delivery ongoing, so that you don't have a black hole developing in your budget going forward. And that's exactly what we have done. Moving on, we've got council tax collection performance, which was very good for the year. We exceeded the target, and we're actually getting quite a high level of total life collection as well, a lot higher than I anticipated, so that's good. Then we did have to write off during the year, during the last quarter, a council tax bill which was greater than the 5,000. Up to 5,000 I have delegation to sign off. This is between 5 and 10, which I have delegation as long as I consult with the chair and the vice chair, which I have done. So we've written that off during the year. It was due to the debtor being insolvent, and they'd already obtained a debt relief order. So there was nothing that can be done once one of those is in place. That brings the total that we wrote off during the year of just over £43,000. Business rate collection, this one not quite as good as the council tax, just a slight slip at the end of the year, just dropped a little bit below the target, but not to a figure that is worrying. So again, good performance during the year in collection. No debts written off in the last quarter, and 11,000 written off during the year. The water rate collection performance, we started the year with 65,000 of arrears, of balances outstanding. we now got a current balance of 101,000, so it has increased. Of that 65,000, we've only managed to collect 8,000 during the year of what was brought forward from the previous year. So the level of actual arrears in the year is lower than what we had during the previous year. But our problem is that the arrears that we've brought forward isn't just a single year. Now we've done more analysis, and of that figure, there is quite a lot of water rates that are outstanding that go back over a period of between 1 and 10 years. So we will be further pushing to try and get collection of that. But early warning to members that I think in the new year we will be looking to write off more water rates that are outstanding. We've written off 4,000, just over 4,000 during the quarter. And that's a good example where, although it only related to one person, it was related to 10 separate water rate bills over a period of 10 years. The person is insolvent, again, no chance of recovery. I think we may find that on more of those cases going forward.
May I just ask a question on, just for clarification? Current balance 101,000, collection rate 88,000. So that looks to me like it should be about 12,000 outstanding, but it says 4,100.
Now you're talking of the balance outstanding. It's the collection rate is on the total to be collected on the 851,000.
Okay, right.
Housing rate collection rate here of just under 96%, which I think is a good collection rate. Current balance is up slightly on what we brought forward, but again, there's an element of old debt built into there, which again, I think there's an element of cleansing of some of the debt that we inherited in the brought forward from 2017-18. Again, we wrote off just over 3,000 during the last quarter under my delegation. That was due to the person being deceased. And unfortunately, there was no funds within the estate that we could secure. Sundry debt position, current balance at the end of the year, 451,000 outstanding. Below that 451, 250,000 was still within terms, i.e. was less than 30 days, so it wasn't overdue. It was credit we've given people, but we've given them 30 days to pay. The total amount overdue was 200,000, which is down from what it was 12 months ago. So that one is heading in a better direction. And the small amount written off, 2 invoices during the quarter of £734, one for a deceased and one was uneconomical to chase because the debtor had moved abroad and the cost of chasing a person not within the UK is quite extensive and wouldn't have been worth the sum that was outstanding. And finally, treasury management activity, as I've reported all year, and I think the previous 151 officer had reported that the council is significantly under borrowed, has been for a period of time by about £5 million. And what we mean by that is that the council has invested in capital, financed it from prudential borrowing, but hasn't taken out the external borrowing. What it's done is it's used its own cash balance in the interim to support that. And as we said, it's not sustainable in the long term because your cash balances will likely to reduce. That did happen to a certain extent in March, and therefore to ensure that the council didn't have a risk of getting too close to its overdraft position and remained with a positive liquid position, I sanctioned some loans of 1.25 million against that 5 million of under borrowed to bring the council's cash holding back within a reasonable figure. I did that over 3 separate loans because the loans should be taken out similar to the life of the assets that were financed. So we did a quick review of the prudential borrowing that had been taken out over the last 10 years, the life of the assets, and did some borrowing broadly equal to the life of some of those assets. Again, it was a good time to borrow as at the end of March, the gilt yields reduced to almost a historic low. So the rates we secured were very, very good. And I think in 2 years' time, people will be surprised to see how you secured rates that low. But at that point, they were very, very, very good rates. They're still quite low at the moment due to the uncertainty in the markets. But I say, if you go back over history, I think there was only 1 week that they've ever been lower in the last 30 years. So that's the report. As I say, hopefully we will be bringing back, as long as the auditors don't create or find an issue, we'll be bringing back the actual statutory accounts to the next meeting, which will reconfirm this position and hopefully give us a positive, clean set of accounts with a positive opinion going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I take questions for Russell, I would just like to thank you very much indeed, Russell, for the well-organised and timely manner in which you have dealt with the accounts this year. It's very, very refreshing that that we've actually got our accounts on time. You know, we're now in a much better financial shape as far as our organisation is concerned. So it's a big thank you to you for actually getting this sorted. Thank you. Councillor Smith.
Thank you, Chairman. You somewhat stole the words out of my mouth in that respect. Yeah, I'd agree. And again, reports are, getting clearer and better. So thank you. Just regarding expenses for senior managers, I mean, we've covered this ground before. I'm glad to hear it's being sort of rehashed in a way in the new year, because it's not, glad it's there, but it's not particularly meaningful at the moment. Just on top of page 31 on the old debts, presumably the sort of 25,000 of old debt, essentially that should have really been caught in previous accounting systems. So we've got a bit, this is sort of a clearing out of old debt, is it? That's why it's appearing to be quite a large figure of 38,000.
Yeah, quite an element of the brought forward debt that has been difficult to collect. The council tax team back in, I think they're based in St Austell, started chasing down some of the overdue debts once we sorted out the billing for the current year and got the current year collection in place, which we had a few issues at the beginning of last year. Once that was in place, they then started turning their attention to trying to collect some of the older debt. And yeah, some of it, there's a lot that goes back to the 2012. And some of that 2012, our balance is brought forward from a previous period. So it's difficult to actually collect that because you're past statutory dates, etc. And the records are just not there to really enforce it.
Okay, thank you. Just moving on to Appendix B, pages 38, 39. Yeah, I mean, a point on vacancy management, as been pressed before, it's good to understand our figures on vacancy management. I think what we're not getting to grips with those, what's the impact of those vacancies on services? Have we got job adverts out? If so, why? Can we manage without these people? Do we need these people? Are they impacting our services? So I think as a council, we need to get to grips with that somewhat. And just a note on the underspend on early years for the 3 to 4 year olds. Kind of good, but I guess the flip side is, could that be a budget pressure in the future? So essentially that's a saving, but maybe spend later on sort of situation.
It's a saving here, but it's not one that we've brought forward as a saving in the savings plan going forward. So we shouldn't be caught out by it.
Thank you. And then just a couple of details there on the waste and recycling, the 117,000 on freight haulage and waste disposal costs. Just like to understand why that overspend, and also just picking up on the 325 overspend on the water. We know it was obviously a very difficult year last year in terms of water supply and management. But are there lessons we can learn for the future there? And in terms of if we hit that situation again, would it cost that amount again? If you see what I mean, the overspend.
Chairman, if I can come back on some of those points in terms of the infrastructure. Year on year, it's actually quite difficult to predict because obviously in terms of waste management, the more waste we actually create, the more cost it is to the council. So there are kind of, fluctuations, from year to year. I think the issue with waste management is that we are campaigning. We will continue to campaign to try and reduce waste, minimise waste, but also look at solutions to provide on-island management of waste. And of course, you will be looking at a report later today, which hopefully helps manage the whole waste situation. In terms of the overspend on water and sewerage, the one thing I would say, and I think I made this point, I think, earlier in the year, that if you actually look at the amount of income that we actually get from water and sewerage, it's more than actually the direct costs of that service. So clearly, we did have pressures last year. We continue to have pressures in terms of water, particularly given the fragility of water resources. And of course, the report that I'll be presenting next talks around some of those issues in terms of how we can better manage that resource. But I think the point is that most of that overspend is because we didn't generate quite so much income to actually pay for some of the kind of support services, particularly in terms of to cover management costs and those other support services. So it's a bit of a mixed message in terms of water and sewerage, but I think on the whole, income actually did exceed the actual costs, direct costs of the service.
Thank you. Councillor Williams.
Thank you. Could I just ask a question about borrowing? In section 12, you helpfully explain the underlying requirement, which was one of my questions anyway. And I'm conscious that in a couple of agenda items' time, we might be looking in principle to borrow another 700,000. Do you anticipate that over the coming years, we will be getting close to that 5 million in terms of borrowing that's set out in the underlying requirement?
Currently, cash balances are looking reasonably healthy. I think we'll always have an element of under-borrowed position that we can carry forward. What you've got to remember is the 5 million will actually increase because part of the capital programme is finance going forward over the next 3 years from potential borrowing. So our borrowing requirements are increasing. I'm not sure we'll ever get up to having to be 100% borrowed, because if we hold reserves, say the general fund reserve is currently 2 million, that should really, there will be cash that backs that, and it's whether we use that cash to keep our borrowing down in the short term. So I would think that we'll always keep less than the total requirement, but we will get closer to that 5 million. We won't be so far under as we go. So we will have to take out more borrowing over the next 2 to 3 years, including this year. And it may well be advantageous to take some more further in this year if rates stay very, very low because of the position in the markets at the moment.
Thank you. Councillor Grottek.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to add my thanks as well for the readability of the report, which is, as we know, generally pleasing, but there will be areas where we should be carefully monitoring, as we've just mentioned, waste and recycling and water and sewage being one of those areas. I'd also like to publicly thank the senior managers for finding the shortfall in savings from their budgets, because it was a not inconsiderable sum, 80,000, and the fact that they managed to find it from their budgets, I think we should acknowledge with grateful thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Sims.
A couple of things. First of all, I have no interest to declare. Secondly, Dominic Raab is out, the rest of them got through, and which I'm sure is of interest. And a question regarding written off debt. I'm sort of aware what your answer is going to be, but others may not be. In any organisation, inevitably this happens year on year. Is this an aberrant year? Because I think it'd be quite useful to get a table of the previous 3 or 4 years at some point, or next year's report rather.
I think going forward, I can probably commit to bringing forward a monitoring in the next year, which will also include what we've written off this year. Going back in previous years, I think the level of accuracy of the data is debatable, and I'm not sure we've got any records that actually prove anything has been written off, which is why one of the reasons that we're writing off so much now. Very little was written off. So going forward, we'll monitor it, we'll carry on monitoring it as we are, and I'll take on board the view that we need to lock this down as a year so we can manage against this and see whether next year is a lower figure or higher figure, and then the year after and the year after we can develop the trend. One thing I'd say is that, you know, any debt that is old is provided for in the accounts. So we have a provision in the accounts. So as we write it off, we write it against the provision. In theory, if we're better at collecting going forward, the provision that we require will reduce. Therefore, there will be no further impact on the revenue budget going forward. But that's assuming that we get debt and we don't start getting more debt coming in the future.
Okay, and regarding the exit package of the previous chief executive, now the figure that we've got there is very similar to the figure we had in January, and I'm aware that there was an FOI put in about this, and it was basically rejected, and then it rejected upon appeal, but it just seems it was slightly odd that we have it now in the papers. It's very close to the original figure.
The figure isn't in the paper. If you read it, it's worded that there is an overspend in an area and a proportion of that is relating to that. The figures that are publicly available, and I'm not going to quote or comment on them today, there are publicly available figures that we have to produce as part of the statutory process on the accounts. The council's draft accounts are now published on the council's website. That is the analysis that we have to produce and show by law. That's the analysis, and the only analysis we will be showing on this.
Thank you. We have a recommendation in front of you with 6 items under it, which I intend to take as one. Could I please have a proposer for the adoption of that recommendation, please? Councillor Smith and a seconder. Councillor Mumford. All those in favour? It's unanimous. Thank you very much. So we move on to item 10 on the agenda, Climate Risk and Water Security Adaptive Action Plan, page 41. Again, in the hands of Craig Dryden. Thank you.
So, Chairman, this report relates to an opportunity to actually seek potentially some additional funding to invest in coastal protection, specifically around the whole issue around water resources, and actually to protect the delivery of water resources as well. And also you'll see from the report as well, added to that also to introduce some complementary measures to actually alleviate water scarcity and all the associated economic, environmental and public health risks which go along with the whole issue around water resources. You'll see from the report that there is a time-limited opportunity to develop an initial bid, and then that will be followed up by a fuller business case, which of course will be brought back to members at a later date. And part of that wider business plan will also be worked through with the expert advice of the Environment Agency as well, who are working alongside. So you'll see that there are 4 recommendations. They're all interlinked. What I would point out is in terms of recommendation 4, slight typing error, it should read 4.26 million. Okay, so with that, members can see there are 4 recommendations relating to climate risk and a water security adaptive action plan.
Thank you. Are there any questions, please, for our Senior Manager for Infrastructure? Thank you, Dan. Councillor Marcus.
How are we going to do this? Well, we've got vacancy management, which is running at quite a high level. We've got some issues that need resolving within the council as it is. It looks like a good project, but my concern would be taking on too much. We're taking on some quite big projects as they are. This is another doubling of the capital programme. I mean, what happens if something goes wrong? What are the mitigations?
So Chairman, the project actually is an expansion of an existing project. And the caveat is that as part of actually the project cost and the bid funding, will actually tied into that will be some additional project management support, and particularly through the Environment Agency. So at the moment, my view is that this is an opportunity, and there is actually inbuilt capacity to actually manage this project moving forward.
Thank
So
you.
sorry, that's from existing staff then?
Chairman, that will be a mix of existing staff plus also some external support, particularly through the Environment Agency.
Thank you. Councillor Williams.
Thank you. I was just slightly surprised that there was no mention at all of the Duchy of Cornwall as the principal landlord for any of the areas in the blue box. Are they financially involved in any of this? And are they, I guess they're strategically involved, but just some clarification on what they are or aren't doing would be helpful.
So, Chairman, at this stage, they're not directly involved in the project, no, but of course they will be indirectly involved as landowners, so they will be consulted on.
Thank you. Councillor Sims.
Great report, thank you. And I also share Dan's reservations about staff resources for, without mentioning any names. I think that a question like Mr. Creosote will keep on eating and eating and eating until he explodes. So I'm slightly worried about the staff resources for this, and the great report. And it's good to have water in there again, because I know it's been a bit wet recently, but it won't be wet forever. And every litre saved now is a litre that's there next time.
Thank you. Councillor Smith.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a clarification on point 1A, the coastal risk modelling showing mean sea level is 34 to 60 centimetres, 36 centimetres higher. Since what point? What's the measurement point there?
Chairman, a good question, and I'm not sure if I've got the answer to that.
Have an action point to clarify that at some point. That'd be good. Yeah, I mean, again, I endorse what Councillor Sims says about water. I think essential that we're looking at rainwater harvesting and storage options. I think that's really, really important for the islands going forward strategically. And yeah, endorse the comments made before around capacities, but that clearly the climate change adaptation is absolutely essential for the islands, and you know, we are on the front line of it in terms of sea level rises and changes in climate. So fully endorse the thrust of the report. Just briefly, if I can, on finance, in terms of the capital that we need to support this, what are the repayments on this? What are we looking at in terms of annual repayments, and how does that fit into the budgeting? Or is it all externally funded? Sorry. All external.
Chairman, the bid actually is for European funding, so it's actually external funding we're seeking.
100%.
100%.
Yeah.
Well, there will be, Chairman, there will be some match funding, but we're looking at match funding from sources outside of the local authority.
Yeah, thank you.
Is that what the private column is on page 44?
Chairman, that's correct.
Right.
Thank you. So we have 4 recommendations in front of you. Could I please have a proposer that they be adopted as one? Councillor Sims, seconded by Councillor Smith. All those in favour? Unanimous. Thank you. So item 11 is the Organic and Thermal Treatment and Energy Recovery Project, page 49. It's the hands of our Senior Manager, Nicola. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. So we're talking again about the waste to energy solution. It's been a long journey to find the right solution. We started off a few years ago now with the energy infrastructure plan, where we thought perhaps AD and gasification, anaerobic digestion and gasification was the right solution for the islands. We need to find a local waste solution. We need to find local sewage solutions. We need to protect the environment. We need to reduce what's shipped to the mainland. We also need to make sure we meet our regulatory standards. The work's concluded that the anaerobic digestion and gasification process isn't appropriate for the islands, and funding for that solution has now been withdrawn by the LEP. We had a letter on the 14th of this month, a couple of days ago. As an alternative approach, we've been pursuing in-vessel composting and thermal treatment, and did a business case that was presented to an informal workshop of members recently. So the business case that we submitted to the Local Enterprise Partnership for Growth Deal funding has been successful. And we have an offer letter for funding from the local enterprise partnership from the growth deal for in-vessel composting and thermal treatment, having withdrawn the funding letter for the AD gasification. So it would have been nice to get the letter saying we have got funding before the letter arrived that said we hadn't, but the ordering of the letters came in the wrong order and made me worry for a few moments. But we have now got funding for a solution. The question we've got to now deal with is that the right solution, and does it address the barriers that we think we've got? So we've picked up on a number of things that we're going to have to think about before we actually draw down that grant. So what we need to do at this stage is say, can we match fund the grant offer, but buy ourselves some time to do some more work around, is this the right solution in terms of the technical requirements? So if you remember from the workshop, one of the things that we've got an issue with potentially on thermal treatment is we want to use something that's low carbon, or want to use something that recycles oil rather than diesel. So we need to find the right solutions. So the consultants that are working with us now looking at what those options might be. And we haven't got the final solution. It'll be a piece of plant, but we don't know what the right solution is. So at this point in time, we don't know what the answer is. We think it's in-vessel composting and thermal treatment, but we don't know exactly which bit of kit it is. We've got a bit of funding that's been offered over here, and we need to prove to the funders that we've got match funding in place if we want to access it. So what they've said is, in principle at this stage, can you confirm the council are still in the game? Are you still happy to pursue a waste to energy solution using growth deal funding for in-vessel composting and thermal treatment? And the question today is, can we agree to that as in principle at this point? But moving forward over the summer months, we've got further work to do around looking at the implications for delivery, the financial case, the technical requirements for that bit of kit. We heard previously that there was a composting machine bought for the waste site a number of years ago, but it was the wrong piece of kit, or people didn't have the right skills to do it. Let's not make that same mistake again. Let's make sure we meet the funding requirements, but let's make sure we do the right preparation before we sign the grant agreement. So what I'm suggesting today is that we in principle approve the funding that would allow us to take the grant if we want to take it forward in the autumn, that we do some further due diligence and financial appraisal at this stage, working with Russell over the financial case. We bring a further report back to you to say whether we want to go forward with that as a business case or not. And at that stage, we would draw down funding to progress the project. At this point in time, I'm suggesting we agree to match fund it, but we don't draw down the grant. We just use that time to do some further due diligence, and that we don't draw that down the grant until we've got a full business case that we've signed off with Russell, that stacks up and comes before this council with the right technical solution that looks at the low carbon solutions, that looks at the financial viability. So at the moment in time, I don't know which bit of plant would be the right piece of plant. So I don't want to draw down the grant yet, because we might have to return it. So what we're doing is buying a bit of time until the autumn while we go through that process. So the recommendations today are to in principle approve the funding for the project, but to accept there's further due diligence and financial appraisal work to do, that we will bring back a further report before we draw down any of that grant. What allows us to do is to test the pre-planned application stage, to get the technical work done, and to find out if it's the right solution for the islands. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Any questions or comments for Nicola, please? Councillor Nellams.
Yes, thank you. You've just described the whole process, and there are a lot of points that you make. And I just wondered on a practical level, and you've actually really answered the question, is the sort of the time that this will take, the vessel composter, the thermal treatment, the option 3, which is the favourite. Do we know how quick this is in the practical sense? You know, we bung it in one end and it comes out the other. Are we talking, do we know how long we're talking? No, in the process, in terms of the process.
Not at this stage, because it depends which bit of kit we get and what size it is. So at the moment, we're looking at what's the right scale, what's the right module, what's the right unit. So there are different suppliers with slightly different processes and slightly different sizing. And we're looking at what the different modules might be that would best suit our needs, and they will all impact on that end-to-end process.
I just didn't know if we had any background. Just only saying it because it's mentioned as Tresco, and it's a quite extraordinary machine. You know, we bung it in at one end, a horrible mess, and it comes out 36 hours later. Minimise to probably 5% of what we've thrown in and useful. Well, we think it's useful. We don't know that yet. I'm being encouraged to chuck it all over the place and see what happens, but I'm holding off on that. But I wondered, it's just that speed of process from one end to the other.
I think because the scale's slightly different, there'll be a slightly different time
That's what I
scale.
wondered. It's obviously going to be a bit longer. I just wondered if we get that and it can't keep up with the process of food waste and vegetable matter going in.
Thank you. Councillor Sims.
Well, this little report we've got here is the tip of an absolutely enormous iceberg, and thank you, Nicola, because you were really up against it to get the funding and everything through, because it wasn't looking that good early in the year. So, brilliant job, and thank you. And I would like to propose we accept all three.
Councillor Smith.
Thank you, Chairman. I support Councillor Nellam's comments about the Tresco Investable Composter. It was, a very impressive piece of kit, and, all in favour of investable composting. I think, when we met before, members had some concerns around the thermal treatment, and in particular the fuel source, which I know you've taken on board as comments. But I think as we're talking about principles and we have just declared a climate emergency, I'd like to propose an additional recommendation, which is that the use of fossil fuels in the thermal treatment is undesirable and contrary to the zero carbon 2030 targets. A low carbon technology to generate heat in the thermal treatment needs to be found. So I'm going to propose that as a number 4 recommendation, please.
Yeah.
What you've mentioned there is the sort of thing that we will be examining in the options for the full report that will come within the business case. So it's one of the options that should be explored, is how to minimise the carbon footprint and how to minimise use of any fossil fuels. So it absolutely would be form part of that for business case as an options appraisal anyway.
But I think it's important that we lay down a principle to support the policies that we've set already in terms of the climate emergency. So hopefully that is complementary to where you're going with the report.
Thank you. Councillor Grottick.
Thank you, Chair. Can we just go back a little bit and just clarify 2 things? That option, that number 13 on page 52, that the community venture company is no longer considered to be part of the operating mechanism of what we are now. This is a definite change of policy. I support that. I can see all sorts of reasons why that's a good idea, but I just want to clarify that they're not actually, the gate fees and everything else is no longer in the mix. Is that correct?
Yeah, again, we'll cover it in the main report when it comes back to you, but the delivery option is now with the council, and that reflects the fact that we've now looking at the Morwell site, the existing waste site, and in terms of the complexity of the operation, it would seem quite ridiculous to start thinking about another operator at this time, because we've got a number of different operations down there at the moment. So the waste site operates, we've got the repairs and engineering works down there as well. When we originally looked at the community venture as a solution, it was a different site that was being considered. So it would have been a new operator who would have to come to that site anyway. This is on our existing site now. So our intention would be to keep that within the council operation. Again, we'll cover that in the options report, but it seems the most sensible approach at this stage.
Thank you for that. And lastly, my last point is that at number 24 on page 55, I think as lead member for finance, I ought to just raise members' awareness, which I'm sure they are, of the slight concern that no allowance has been made to fund the council's investment in the council's budget. Therefore, I think we will have to acknowledge that in producing a final business case, a solution to the funding gap will need to be identified. And quite frankly, that will obviously be no mean feat.
That's my point, is the financial business case would be around how you would fund it, how we would fund it as a council, and we'd have to look at what that would be in terms of borrowing, and those borrowing costs would have to be built into the financial case.
Absolutely,
So
I
these
just-
savings would have to go towards the cost of the borrowing. So that's going to give you the on balance. Does this stack up financially within that work?
Absolutely, I'm not being negative, I'm just acknowledging the challenge, and I think if it's in the report with Russell sitting there, I think we should take it on board, so to speak.
Thank you. Councillor Williams.
Thank you. In terms of a business case, could I just ask us to dial back on point 14, where we talk about the soil conditioner being available for free? If Councillor Nellam has discovered what he's spreading on his ground is liquid gold, it could be something we live to regret in the future. And I'm aware that people here have long memories, so it would be desirable for it to be free, but I wouldn't like us to go down that line and then find there's a cost implication.
We'll just check where that comes from. I suspect it's to do with state aid, but we'll go back and double check that for you.
Thank you. Councillor Sims.
Well, what's the sort of timeline on this? Roughly, I'll be ballpark.
Yeah, so to receive the funding, we have to have this contracted and on site March 21. So it's quite a compact timeline. So the project plan, it's quite a tricky one. What we're looking at is getting the pre-planning stage brought forward now. So start doing those pre-planning discussions with the planning team, start having discussions with the regulators about the licensing to see if we can bring the programme forward. The good news here is that because it's plant, it's not like you've got to build it. You've got to have a platform to sit it on or building to put it in potentially, but actually the plant itself is a bit of kit that comes off the shelf. So we can order it, we can deliver it. It's not got to be built on site. So it's one of those ones where it might seem a very tight timeline, but at the moment we've got a project plan from our consultants that say it is deliverable, it is possible. What we need to think about is how we bring some contingency in on that. So what can we do now ahead of time without too much cost or resource to make sure that we can still make that timeline. But at the moment we're confident that we can meet the timeline.
Yeah, but the reason I'm asking because hopefully by this time next year, South West Water will be essentially dealing with our water and sewage, and they will be providing the sludge, I guess, for it. But it will be a council asset, so there would be presumably gate fees from South West Water.
Part of the financial case looks at what that gate fee needs to be. The difficulty, one of the challenges that I've listed in the report actually is the timeline for South West Water's sewage treatment plant. So they don't actually match. So what we're thinking about is, can this be done in a modular way? So the first bit of feedstock we know is guaranteed, which is our existing waste, but the additional feedstock, which is the greater volume, comes from potentially South West Water's sewage sludge as part of that new system. And we need to be able to design this so it can actually be scaled up should that sludge need to come through this treatment plant as well. So we're assuming initially we'll have a relatively low volume of waste, about 200 tonnes a year. That will increase by another 500 once the sewage sludge comes through the system. And that's one of the technical challenges. How can you build this up in a modular fashion to accommodate that increasing volume?
Because I'm gathering from the report, it needs a certain volume to keep going, like the dimension of importing sawdust, which strikes me as slightly aberrant, if you like.
So one of the challenges and one of the assumptions I think that probably Jonathan would want to pick up on as well is that we need to make sure this is scaled to our needs and we don't finish having to create another feedstock that we have to grow or import to fuel it. So one of the challenges, as I say, is about that, getting that scale right is absolutely essential, which is why I want to spend the time doing the preparation now rather than getting potentially a white elephant that's the wrong solution. So it's absolutely right to spend time on the preparation to make sure we've got the right scale and solution.
Thank you. Councillor Marcus.
Yeah, I just want to ask about timescales. Say March 21 for this one. Look at the previous plan that starts kind of April 20 to April 22. The next project we're looking at, that's early quarter one, quarter two, 2021. That's a lot happening. We've got the integration project as well. The island's going to be a bit of a building site for a few years if this all comes off at the same time. I'm not sure everyone's going to be too keen on that.
There's some challenge and opportunity there, I suppose. The opportunity is if you dig in a hole in the road, let's put as many things down there at the same time as we can. So if we're going to dig a hole, then who else needs to have a hole dug at the same time? Can we manage the construction process so that we've got workers on the site at the same time, so that we've got potentially key worker accommodation or seasonal worker accommodation or construction accommodation built into the format? And I think was it Kier when they were building over here, they built a sort of a construction village. So there's an opportunity about bringing those resources together and doing a lot of work at the same time, because there might be things that we need to do together to solve the housing issues or to bring the right skills to the island. It's going to be hectic in terms of our resources. So we've built into the programme external project management support, because realising the implications of the scale of these projects and the time restrictions on it needs very careful management. So we've built in the need for additional resource for project management as part of the costings of the project, because we can't cope with the additional needs that we'd have to run all these projects with the resources we have, but they can legitimately be included within the cost for the project as part of the project task.
Okay, yeah, it doesn't really, just thought of integrating all those projects all at the same time. It's hard enough getting one project done over here on time and in budget, let alone 4 or 5 different projects. So it's going to be a challenge, I think.
Thank you. Councillor Legg.
Thank you. Forgive me if it was covered in the report. I did read it, but I couldn't find it, the answer to this. So it's referred to as an organic thermal treatment plant, but it does mention it would possibly be able to take mattresses and carpets. Usually, from my experience, they contain materials that, when incinerated, produce an ash that is not particularly pleasant. This might be a bit too technical question for now, but you get where I'm going.
Get what you're saying. It's probably my fault, because it should say it's the organic composting and thermal treatment of other waste. So the other waste is not organic. It's our normal waste now. It is the mattresses, it is the furniture, it's all those other things. The organic bit relates to the composting.
Okay, so the ash from this incinerator would contain plastic matter. What is the plan to deal with that before we had an ALP?
So, Craig, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is the ash is the product at the end of the process that cannot be used on the island, and that forms part of what has to get shipped back to the mainland for treatment and disposal.
Councillor Sims.
Referring just a little to the off-islands, Diana Pampaloki has talked to me about whatever it is you got on Tresco, and she was wildly enthusiastic. You're wildly enthusiastic, and she did sort of say at the time that it would be really, really useful to have them on the other islands as well. And that obviously there's a funding thing. Could we maybe tie the whole thing in, or am I overcomplicating something that's already massively complicated?
I don't think we've lost sight of the fact that that might be the right solution for the off-islands. It's just not part of this project, but it is certainly part of the thinking around that holistic approach to waste.
Councillor Smith.
Thank you. Just wanted to sort of emphasise that I think, this is a really important step forward for the islands. And actually this is, let's not lose sight of the fact that this is a big transformation in our waste management. So despite this kind of harsh questioning, I think, we're sort of fully in support, I hope, of the principles of what we're trying to achieve here. This is quite big stuff, really. Big change.
Thank you. Now, we have an extra recommendation that the use of fossil fuels is undesirable, and that we need to look for a low carbon solution, and that's proposed by Councillor Smith. Do I have a seconder,
Well, I'm
please?
happy to append it to my original proposal.
Yeah. So, so you're seconding that effectively.
Well, no, I would add it to my initial proposal.
Yeah, but your proposal was to adopt the recommendation. So we have an additional one now. And could I have a seconder for the additional? That's Councillor Marcus. So all those in favour of the additional recommendation? Thank you. And now we'll go back to the original recommendation to accept all the rest of the recommendations. And could I have a seconder for that, please? All those in favour? It's unanimous. Thank you. So we'll move on to item 12. Now the council homes programme update, again in the hands of Senior Manager Nicola. Thank you.
Yes, Councillor Marcus, we will be busy. So the next item is the Council Homes Programme update. So I did speak to you in November around our ambition. We signed off the vision and objectives, and I thought it was really important to bring you a progress and update of where we've got to since November. And I've attached within the pack the study that's been undertaken by some consultants that was funded externally to help us drill down a little bit more into our challenges in terms of delivery on the islands and help explain the case for the Isles of Scilly, if you like, to our funders. Not only has it done that, but it's also given us some key next steps and identified what we need to do as part of our project plan and our project planning to be successful in delivery. And I know the chairman would love us to develop homes within the next 3 months and be on site. But the reality of the situation is we have to prepare well. We have to get the ground conditions studied. We have to make sure we get all the right investigations before we move forward with construction. So there's a great deal of work to do behind the scenes before we actually get that picture of the chairman with the spade in the ground on the site. So my apologies for the length of time it takes. I've tried to explain why it takes so long in the report and the different stages of the process. But I'm confident with the approach that we're taking it now, with the resources that we've now got, that we have a small delivery team that's now been built up using both our own funding and external funding, that we can progress much more quickly through the process and make sure that we deliver as quickly as we can. I think for me, the next steps really will involve the illustrative layouts for the sites that have been identified. And we start that community engagement in the autumn. So we take those illustrative plans to the community, we take the house designs, the pattern book of what we'd like to deliver, ask whether it makes the sort of expectations in terms of the local distinctiveness and character. We look at the boring stuff, if you like, the technical specifications for what the houses might be like and how sustainable they can be, to make sure that what we actually then commission and purchase meets our requirements. So very much sustainability at the heart of those house designs, at the heart of those layouts. And for me, the next steps really are around seeking additional funding, getting people on board. So I've got a whole raft of different visitors coming to the island over the next few weeks, from housing associations through to Homes England, looking at what opportunities there might be for external funding, working with partners, narrowing down our options for delivery. At the moment, we've got no delivery partner. Some people have been and gone. We're still looking at directly delivering these sites ourselves at this stage, but that doesn't mean I won't be looking at delivery partners as we go through and de-risk the sites. So at this stage, to note the report and just to give a delegated authority for submission of some further funding bids through what's called the Small Sites Fund, and anything else that might come our way that over the coming months, so that we can just crack on with trying to get the delivery sorted out and the plans ready for discussion with the community. So that's the update from November. It doesn't sound a lot, but there's been quite a lot of work going on behind the scenes, and certainly that report will be invaluable as we start talking to funders about the case for Scilly and for grant funding, and to allow us to take the programme forward. Thank you.
Thank you. There's no questions for Nicola. I'd like to take the two recommendations together, please. Could I have a proposer? Councillor Watt.
Sorry, Chairman, can I just ask a question about the vision and the terms of reference? Sorry. Just have members seen the terms of reference for the Housing Delivery Forum before?
In draft format.
Still in draft, okay. And building a minimum of, the key objective, building a minimum of 30 houses by the end of financial year 21-22 is really, really ambitious. Is that realistic?
Starting would be good.
Yeah, maybe insert that word in there. Other than that, yes, very interesting report. Thank you.
Councillor Legg.
Thank you, Chair. I couldn't help but notice that on the concept layout, and I'm aware they're just concepts at this point, the out-of-town sites don't include car parking spaces, whereas the sites in Hewtown include car parking on a one-to-one basis. Now, given that we are trying to discourage that, it seems a little bit backwards.
I think that will come out in the detail of the specifications. Certainly, we're not asking for parking on a one-to-one basis. We would look at potentially car share, electric vehicle charging points and car share and courtyard parking to enable that to happen. So certainly that will come out in the next iteration. But it gets the debate going, doesn't it? Do we need car parking? Will we be able to use these properties without? Will people share? And that will then feed into who's going to be eligible for those homes and who's going to sign up to that as a concept. So it'll be quite an interesting process.
Thank you, Councillor Williams.
Thank you, Chairman. I welcome all the references to the health and wellbeing aspects of the plan. Would ask that health and wellbeing would somehow factor into that flow chart. Again, recognising good quality housing and the most important.
Excuse me, could you put your button on again?
Excuse me, sorry about that. I'd also like, if possible, some sort of workshop on community land trust. It sounds like there's a huge amount of opportunities around that particular style of delivery, but it's not something I'm particularly familiar with, so that would be useful as well. And I'd also just like some clarities. The primary school site at Carn Thomas, there's been lots of chatter recently about what it's going to be used for. Is our preferred option for it to be used for housing at this point in time? There's also been discussion about more community use element to that plot.
So the local plan, Craig will correct me again if I'm wrong, allocates the site for housing use, the primary school site. I think the ambition in the local plan is to deliver 105 affordable homes. Now, if you lose a site for another purpose, you need to find another site. So I think there'll be a little bit of some come forward, some are taken out. At the moment, we don't know what the right solution is for the primary school site. So the number of units that can deliver for housing, the opportunity might be greater for another use. So I'm hoping there's some flexibility in the local plan that allows some movement between sites if a better use comes for that primary school site. So I don't think the local plan would rule it out, but at the moment it is allocated for residential purposes.
Yeah, I think the local plan had 30 sites listed, was that correct? And then they were scored and certain sites were prioritised.
Yeah, Chairman, for clarification, the site actually at Carn Thomas for the original school actually is relatively small in terms of housing numbers. And of course, there is flexibility within the local plan because obviously it does allow for windfall developments. And clearly part of that 105 target is not just St Mary's, but of course it's all of the off-islands as well, where we haven't identified any sites at all.
Thank you. Would you like to continue, Councillor Williams?
And can I just also clarify an element of risk? Is the assumption that we wouldn't buy any sites until every last detail is in place? Again, I don't want to be in a position where, as a local authority, we own 2 very nice fields, but we don't have anything lined up to go on them.
Yeah, it's a bit of a chicken and egg, isn't it? So we're playing the game of trying to get as much information as possible about the sites before we conclude any negotiations on their purchase. We have the Duchy as a delivery partner at this stage in terms of exploring sites, and it would be useful at some stage to have control over those sites so that we can take control of the pace and type of delivery. The critical bit is when is the right point to do that? And there's further due diligence to do in terms of those sites, first of all. So things keep coming out of the woodwork. The local plan should give us the certainty that in principle those sites are suitable for development. The local plan won't be adopted until sometime next year. So there's always that little bit of doubt, and that's part of the risk that we might have to take. Now, when you're weighing up that risk, if you're paying £10,000 per plot or £100,000 per plot, will depend on how much risk you'd want to take. So I think there's a little bit about, it's not the right time yet to make that final deal, but I think we need to have our eye on how much we're going to invest up front on de-risking those sites, before we've got an interest in being able to purchase them at the end of that process. Having said that, as a council, if those sites come forward anyway and they're developed for affordable housing, that's a win anyway. So it's just about how much money we're going to put forward onto sites we haven't got control of at the moment. And that's a fine balance. And that's a discussion I'm having with the chairman at the moment.
Thank you. Councillor Sims.
Well, just relating to that point, this is something we really have to do. However we do it, we have to do it. Two really, really important reports tonight for the island's future, and I think we should really, everybody should really actively push to get them going through. And this builds on the excellent report you gave us, I think, at the December meeting. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, Councillor Smith.
Concur with all comments said already. Just one brief point on key assumptions. I think we need to ensure that the kind of zero carbon targets are written into that as well. I think, so the discussion we've had previously around Con Thomas, we understand it's a key site. It's really interesting to see the plans. And I think I really look forward to the kind of public discussion of the plans. I think that'd be a really interesting process, and we all need to encourage people to get involved in that, I think. Just a brief question then, you touched again on the cost of the sites from Duchy. Do we actually have a handle on what those costs are going to be, or is that sort of yet to be determined? It seems to be potentially large variables, but obviously highly important to the viability of our project.
If this were a normal negotiation on the mainland and we're using Homes England funding, Homes England would expect us to be paying in the region of about £10,000 per plot for an affordable home coming from a field, if you like, so an agricultural value field. So that's the sort of ballpark I'll be expecting to pay, and that's the sort of ballpark that the Homes England people would be expecting to look at in a funding bid. So anything too widely variable from that would be unusual.
Thank you. So we have two recommendations I propose to take together. Could I have a proposer, please, for those? Councillor Mumford, seconded Councillor Watt. All those in favour, please. It's unanimous. Thank you. Our item 13 on the agenda is addressing fuel poverty, energy company obligation, page 155. Again, in your hands, Nicola. Thank you.
So this is, I think, an equally important report, actually, because what it seeks to do is to unlock funding for private rental properties or private owned properties for people to access eco-funding. We've got very poor housing quality stock, but it's particularly poor within the private sector. And high levels of fuel poverty within that sector. But at the moment, the work that we've done around smart energy islands has focused on social properties. By adopting this document, it will allow us to negotiate with energy companies to get grant funding for those properties in the private sector. So it's a starting point. It doesn't necessarily mean we will get funding. It means if we don't have this, we won't have funding. If we have this, we'll at least have the conversation with the energy companies to say, would anybody be willing to come and work with us to address fuel poverty and provide grants on the island? I think the opportunity now is that a lot of the companies have worked on the mainland, have got the low-hanging fruit already. So those people who they could easily access, they could provide really cheap solutions to, have already had their homes improved. And as this eco funding continues, this obligation on the energy companies becomes more and more difficult to achieve. And that's why the Isles of Scilly haven't had it in the past, but are more likely to be able to access that funding in the future. So we need a statement of intent setting out the eligibility criteria for those residents that we think should be able to access that funding. And that flexibility, it's called LA Flex, allows us to expand the criteria beyond those who are on housing benefits, beyond those who are just vulnerable, to allow more people to access the funding. And it really fits in with the health and wellbeing agenda, because used properly and well, this allows more people to access funding that might otherwise be the case with the existing funding criteria. So we've expanded the criteria as widely as we think is possible. We've taken expert advice on it. And this should allow a number of residents to access funding who might not otherwise have been able to do so. So the recommendation before you is that we adopt the proposed statement of intent. That will then be posted on our website, and then we'll start negotiations in conjunction with colleagues in Cornwall with electricity, with energy suppliers to see if they'll be able to access grants on the Isles of Scilly for the first time.
Thank you, Nicola. Councillor Marcus.
Yeah, in the last Health and Wellbeing Board, we had a presentation from the Winter Wellbeing update. How does this project fit in with that project?
They asked us to do this.
Okay, great. Okay.
Councillor Smith. Could you put your mic on, please? Thank you.
Sorry. With my Smart Islands hat on, I'd certainly support the thrust of this. I think one thing we've been quite good at in Smart Islands is generating the energy, but not so good at insulating the houses. So this really ties in very well. One question just I would ask is that I know people in the past on Scilly have tried to access these sorts of grants and found it difficult. So hopefully this will help enable it. But how used to working on Scilly are the people who are going to be coming in to actually doing this work? So I actually think that's quite a critical detail, because I think people have been had their fingers burned on that before.
It's just to note and to be aware of, and when we're having those discussions, we'll raise that. We've had one or two informal discussions so far.
Thank you. Councillor Grottick.
Councillor Smith has actually just referred to what I was going to say. It was hugely frustrating to have leaflets through people's door that encourages, you know, you can have this free and you can have this at reduced cost. And then when they phoned up, several people said to me, they said, oh no, that doesn't cover the Isles of Scilly. And given that we've had real challenging levels of fuel poverty, which so impacts on people's health and well-being, this is a step in the right direction. I'd be very happy to propose this recommendation.
Thank you. Councillor Sims.
This presumably would tie in quite well with the EPC requirements, wouldn't it?
Yeah, so the accessibility relates to the need to bring those poorly insulated properties up to standards. So the focus is on those properties, I think D, E and F, I'll have to just look at the criteria. But because we've been able to expand that and include more within the definition. So hopefully you can pick it up in there somewhere, but we've tried to include it. Normally it would be F and G would be included, and we've tried to include D as well. So we've got D, E, F and G in the low income, high cost and vulnerable to cold category. For those on low income and high cost but not recipient of benefits, it's just the E, F and G properties. So we've expanded it within that second category to include those that are in EPC D, if that makes sense.
Just a thought, it might be useful to say what EPC is for Tim's benefit. Oh, you do? You already know. Good, okay.
It's an energy performance certificate.
Thank you. So we have a proposer for the recommendation. Could I have a seconder, please? Councillor Mumford. All those in favour? It's unanimous. Thank you. Item 14 on the agenda is the Isles of Scilly Fire and Rescue Integrated Risk Management Plan, in the hands of Senior Manager Craig Dryden. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I've lost my voice then. Yes, thank you, Chairman. So members are being, recommendation is to approve the Fire and Rescue Service Integrated Risk Management Plan. So as you'll see from the report and also the contents of the plan, the primary purpose of this plan is to ensure that the right resources are available in response to the specific safety needs of the island communities. And you'll see that the strategic focus is really around improving public safety, reducing the number of emergency incidents, and saving lives through the fire and rescue services, key functions which are around protection, prevention, and response. You'll see that I think it's a fairly detailed plan. It covers a 3-year period. It can be subject to change and subject to review. It is a statutory requirement, and specifically, it does actually incorporate some of the recommendations that we received from the inspection last year from Her Majesty's Inspectorate. So you'll see that the recommendation is to approve the Integrated Risk Management Plan for the next 3 years.
Thank you. Councillor Sims.
as soon as you see risk management plan on a paper, you die a little. But this is a really good piece of work. Thank you, Craig. And it does build on masses and masses of work. Last year, it was a sort of running around like headless chickens because the fire inspector were coming over, and we came out of that really, really well. And certainly compared to lots of places on the mainland, the direction of travel was really good. A couple of small faults, and this just builds on it. So I think we can be really, really proud of the infrastructure department for getting this through, and also not least the actual guys at the coalface. So thank you to everybody. And I would I'd be pleased to propose that the recommendation.
Thank you. And from the chair, Craig, I'd also like to endorse those thanks to you for the efforts that you've made and indeed the excellent feedback that we got on your submission last year. Councillor Marcus.
Yeah, just the table on page 223, just about the home fire safety checks. It's good to see that number's kind of stabilised, and that the paragraph previously states the joint working that the fire service do with adult social care about targeting the over 65 vulnerable people and disabled, and just to highlight that work and to ask that it continues and strengthens.
Councillor Williams.
Thank you, Chairman. We've already touched on vacancy management across the local authority as a whole this evening. I was just wondering what it is like at the moment trying to recruit, especially in the off-islands. Is it challenging, or are you doing well?
In fact, Chairman, you'll see that actually one of the challenges moving forward is because of our population decline and also our demographic profile, particularly with the ageing population, that actually we have highlighted the risk moving forward that actually to get retained firefighters on the off-islands will be an ongoing issue potentially. As it happens at the moment, we do have a full contingent on all of the off-islands. And in fact, at the moment, we've had quite a bit of turnover actually on St Mary's. So we're actually in the process of recruiting additional firefighters on St Mary's. But I think moving forward, there's been some quite interesting developments in terms of how we collaborate and partner with the other emergency services, because they also have the same issues in terms of limited resources. So we had a very good event in January, which I think one or two of you actually attended around the table. And as part of that, what we have developed now is a task and finish group. So we have better collaboration at the strategic level in the Southwest for all the emergency services. And moving forward as well, there'll also be an operational services meeting as well to ensure that we are actually joining up as best we can. But it is something that, I'd never be complacent in terms of saying that we've got sufficient resource in terms of numbers on the ground, because I think moving forward with our population issues and demographic issues, it's something I think which we have to be mindful of and absolutely make sure that we have got, the right capacity and the right resilience, and working with others to ensure that we do have that resilience and capacity.
Thank you. So could I have a proposer for the recommendation, please, to approve the Fire and Rescue Service Integrated Risk Management Plan?
I think I already did.
Oh, yes, you did. Thank you, Councillor Sims. Could I have a seconder, please? Councillor Marcus. All those in favour? It's unanimous. Thank you. Item 15 on the agenda is also in the hands of Craig Dryden, and it's the Fire and Rescue Annual Assurance Statement.
Yes, so Chairman, we have to provide an annual assurance statement to the Home Office for each year, and that's also obviously before members as well, to ensure effectively and to provide that assurance to our communities and of course central government that the Fire and Rescue Service for the Isles of Scilly is actually performing well. So it is effective, it is efficient. We know that it is because we received good for both those elements of the service last year in our HMI inspection, which is absolutely great news. So effectively, members are being requested to endorse the annual assurance statement. It is for the year 2018-19, and I apologise, there is a typing error actually in the title itself, which refers to 17-18. So I think there's a bit of cutting and pasting going on. I apologise for that, but it is definitely for 18-19. So it is a backward document looking at last year's performance.
Thank you. Councillor Smith.
Thank you, Chairman. Again, support the thrust of the document and, congratulations to all involved in getting the good recommendation judgments there. Just a couple of specific questions on page 243 regarding the home fire safety visits. 67 home fire safety visits seems, am I right, that's down, the target for the home safety visits is 100 per year? So are we down on the numbers there?
Chairman, it is ever so slightly, and that's obviously because of some of the resourcing, particularly last year, because of the HMI inspection itself. Actually it did have an impact actually on the service. The one thing that I think we need to drill into is that I'm not entirely convinced that all of the home fire safety visits taking place on the off islands are being appropriately recorded, because it's my understanding that actually our firefighters visit almost, if not every single home, almost every single home on each of the off islands. So I suspect the figure actually is being underreported.
From experience on St Martin's, yes, that's true. And just picking up on page 245, going back through my memory in terms of the investment in the staff, sorry, I think there was some capital spend going to be on hot fire training and staff facilities. Was that right? And if so, what's the progress?
Yes, so Chairman, particularly in terms of the fire attack unit, so what we're trying to do, again, in terms of the effectiveness and efficiency of the service, we're trying to provide more on training actually on islands rather than actually having to go to the mainland, where not only is there a cost to the service, but also it's a major commitment as well for our firefighters. So what we are looking to do at the moment is look for what we call a hot fire behavioural facility or fire attack unit actually on the island. So at the moment, I've asked for a couple of quotes. I just need to find the site. So hopefully within the next 12 months, we can actually make progress on that. So we'll be bringing the trainers over from Cornwall to the islands rather than sending our firefighters back over to the islands. And that's particularly important for things like breathing apparatus training. And the one thing that we are thinking of doing as well is that although statutorily firefighters need to do their training once every 2 years, within a 2-year period, what we're thinking as well is because some of our firefighters aren't exposed to some of the same incidences on the mainland, it gives us more of an opportunity to actually have more regular training on the islands as well, to actually kind of, if you like, fill that gap and make sure that they have got that experience in case we do have major incidents on the islands. And of course, we do have, on occasions, major incidents in terms of fire.
And staff facilities?
Staff facilities at the moment is on hold, so we were looking at the potential for some accommodation linked to the fire station, but at the moment that's been put on hold, and so we're looking at other options. But that's for trainers actually coming over to the islands, not obviously in relation to our retained firefighters, who are all accommodated on the islands.
Thank you. Councillor Sims.
You might want to rephrase more on training. However, I just would, given my comments on the previous report, it would be churlish to say anything else against this one, so I would just like to propose the recommendation.
Thank you. Could I have a seconder, please? Councillor Legg. All those in favour? It's unanimous. Thank you very much. That concludes our part one agenda, but at this